I knew something was fundamentally wrong. At Valence Dynamics Inc., the moment, Gerald Vance, our chief executive officer, who had once broken down in tears in my office during the emergency layoffs of 2020, took the podium at the mandatory all-hands assembly, looking like a man who had just traded his corporate soul for a high-end mindfulness retreat. He adjusted his silk necktie, leaned into the microphone, and announced with uncharacteristic calm that he would be taking an immediate, indefinite leave of absence to attend an executive wellness sabbatical in Sedona, Arizona. He spoke as though he had not spent the preceding 48 hours greenlighting 3 aggressive vendor audits and a sweeping structural reorganization that threatened to gut our operational stability. But the true bombshell fell moments later when Gerald announced that during his absence, full executive control would be handed to his 28-year-old daughter, Chloe Vance, who would serve as acting chief executive officer. Chloe had recently completed an elite business school program that apparently convinced her that tech startup hype, social media branding, and legacy corporate continuity were completely interchangeable concepts. 5 minutes later, Chloe entered the executive auditorium, wearing designer heels that sounded like iron spikes against the polished marble floor and carrying an Italian leather briefcase that cost more than my entire automobile. She flashed a rehearsed smile at the stunned crowd of 300 employees and declared that her primary objective was to modernize our enterprise, speak in the language of hyper-agile growth, and eliminate obsolete operational drag. I attempted to give her the benefit of the doubt for approximately 6 seconds. But that benefit vanished the moment she called an emergency management meeting in the 14th floor conference room and unfolded a color-coded organizational chart across the glass table, as if she were planning a high society seating arrangement for a celebrity gala. She announced with supreme confidence that Valence Dynamics was going lean, young, and hyper-agile, aggressively tapping at employee names on her tablet like a team captain selecting players for a middle school dodgeball match. In Chloe's narrow vision of modern corporate management, 14 years of institutional knowledge was not considered a valuable asset. It was categorized as legacy dead weight. She could not articulate the basic technical distinction between operational compliance and financial auditing, yet she possessed a vast vocabulary of modern corporate buzzwords, including synergy, cross-functional leverage, disruptive scaling, and next-generation paradigm shifts. She informed our procurement director that she demanded more viral momentum in our quarterly metrics, as if organic brand authority could be ordered on demand from a food delivery mobile application. When I politely asked whether she meant targeted customer acquisition campaigns, algorithmic search optimization, or multi-channel engagement, she blinked in complete confusion and asked if I was fundamentally resistant to operational innovation. I was 54 years old and had dedicated 14 consecutive years of my life to Valence Dynamics as Director of Operational Continuity and Systems Compliance. Throughout those 14 years, I had navigated the company through 2 severe economic downturns, 3 complex corporate acquisitions, a massive server infrastructure crash, and the infamous supply chain crisis that nearly bankrupted our Midwest distribution centers. I had personally written the emergency recovery protocols, authored the regulatory compliance architecture, and held our cross-departmental workflows together with meticulous documentation and raw determination. Now, I sat in a conference room watching a 28-year-old with zero profit and loss accountability question whether our enterprise truly needed statutory compliance oversight. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Chloe had already issued termination notices to 2 senior department heads, strutting through the executive corridor like a pageant queen delivering summary judgments. She loudly declared to anyone within earshot that her mandate was to empower high-performing disruptors while eliminating survivors who lacked dynamic vision. I felt a strong urge to ask her how many dynamic disruptors she had ever seen maintain a complex regulatory filing system during a full server meltdown, but I restrained myself. I understood corporate politics, and I was certainly not terrified of technological evolution. But there is a vast difference between strategic evolution and tossing a burning torch into a paper mill. Chloe was not attempting to lead our enterprise. She was performing an act of corporate leadership. Her father had handed her the controls of a complex commercial machine she did not comprehend, and every single employee was trapped inside for the inevitable crash. The atmosphere on the 14th floor deteriorated rapidly over the subsequent 48 hours. Chloe Vance walked through the operational cubicles like an occupying monarch inspecting a defeated province. Every conversation halted when her footsteps approached. She introduced a series of mandatory productivity surveys that required senior software architects and operational managers to account for every 15-minute block of their working day. Those who failed to submit their logs by 5 o'clock were publicly reprimanded on the internal company message board. Meanwhile, the core infrastructure of Valence Dynamics began to exhibit severe stress fractures. Without proper vendor coordination, our primary server deployment in the Dallas data center experienced an unannounced outage, delaying customer fulfillments across 4 major territories. When Sandeep from Logistics attempted to explain to Chloe that bypassing our established secondary redundancy protocol would trigger automatic contractual penalties with our regional shipping carriers, she dismissed his warnings as defensive posturing from an individual unwilling to embrace agile risk-taking. She openly mocked our operational documentation in front of junior staff, claiming that true innovators did not hide behind compliance binders. I watched my team members wilt under the pressure. Nora in procurement was reduced to tears after Chloe rejected a 3-month vendor renewal that protected our raw material pricing, insisting instead on pursuing an unverified offshore supplier who promised 20% cost reductions without offering any regulatory compliance certifications. It became increasingly clear that Chloe was not merely misguided. She was actively destroying the foundation of an enterprise that hundreds of families relied upon for their livelihood. My 14 years of service had taught me that when individuals elevated by nepotism are given unrestricted authority, their first instinct is to dismantle the systems that expose their own incompetence. I began quietly documenting every interaction, every erratic directive, and every regulatory anomaly in my personal physical journal, knowing that the impending storm would require an immutable record of truth. At 3:45 p.m., my email inbox chimed with a high-priority calendar invite titled Urgent Alignment Meeting from the Office of the Acting Chief Executive Officer. There was no agenda attached, no preliminary discussion notes, merely a 15-minute meeting block that felt considerably more like a judicial sentencing than an operational consultation. I gathered my leather notepad, walked down the carpeted hallway of the executive wing, and knocked softly on the heavy oak door. Chloe was already seated behind her father's massive mahogany desk, sipping a thick green smoothie from an expensive glass jar as though she were actively detoxing from operational competence itself. She did not bother looking up immediately, allowing a full 30 seconds of uncomfortable silence to fill the room while she tapped away on her laptop keyboard. Without offering me a seat, she gestured toward the door, telling me to close it behind me. I complied, catching a quick glimpse of my reflection in the side glass pane. My hair was graying at the temples, my shoulders were weary from years of crisis management, but my spine remained completely straight. I recognized the warning signs in her posture because whatever was about to transpire in that office was not going to be a constructive performance review. Chloe set her glass jar down on the polished wood surface, folded her arms, and looked at me with cold indifference. She informed me without hesitation that my position as Director of Operational Continuity no longer aligned with her forward-looking strategic vision. Just like that, 14 years of crisis management, regulatory filings, cross-departmental coordination, and proprietary contingency frameworks were discarded as irrelevant. I stood quietly, processing the absolute absurdity of her statement while my heart pounded against my ribs. I reminded her that under federal workplace regulations and our internal governing bylaws, senior operational roles required a formal 90-day transition plan and appropriate board notification, particularly under statutory standards like the Warren Act regarding structural staff reductions. Chloe offered a condescending smile that radiated pure arrogance, telling me that statutory formalities were for legacy organizations stuck in the past. She pressed an intercom button hidden beneath her desk. Instantly, two hired private security guards from the main lobby entered the office, standing behind me as if I were a dangerous corporate criminal who had been caught exfiltrating proprietary trade secrets. One of the guards gave me a slight nod of sympathy, but he had a job to perform. Chloe stacked her color-coded folders with precise efficiency and told me I could collect my personal belongings immediately under security supervision, or have them shipped to my residential address in cardboard boxes. I maintained my dignity, walking out of the executive suite with my chin held high while the entire floor watched from behind their glass cubicles. Colleagues I had mentored for over a decade looked away in silent panic, terrified that standing up for me would place their own names on Chloe's elimination list. Nora from procurement, Jason from information technology, and Brian from financial operations all kept their eyes glued to their monitors. Security escorted me out of the building as I carried a single box containing my desk lamp, a small stack of physical reference manuals, and a potted succulent I had kept alive on my windowsill for 7 years. I did not scream, I did not plead, and I refused to give Chloe the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I walked out into the afternoon heat, placed the box in the trunk of my car, and sat behind the steering wheel for 20 minutes in absolute silence. It was not the termination itself that stung most fiercely, but rather the sheer arrogance of how it was executed. She viewed 14 years of institutional dedication as nothing more than an obsolete line item to be erased for. A brief moment of corporate theater, sitting in my dimly lit living room that first night after being escorted out, the silence of my home felt suffocating. For 14 consecutive years, my life had been governed by the relentless rhythm of corporate operations, early morning crisis calls, midday executive briefings, and late-night regulatory reviews. To have that entire reality severed in a matter of 15 minutes by a 28-year-old acting chief executive officer who could not read a basic balance sheet was a profound psychological shock. I looked at my reflection in the dark television screen. At 54 years old, re-entering the corporate job market after a high-profile summary dismissal was a daunting prospect. But as the initial humiliation began to subside, a deep, cold clarity took its place. I reflected on the sacrifice I had made for Valence Dynamics. The weekends surrendered to server migrations, the family vacations interrupted by vendor disputes, and the unwavering loyalty I had demonstrated to Gerald Vance when the company faced bankruptcy during the pandemic. Gerald had sat in my office 4 years ago, holding his head in his hands, begging me to restructure our operational framework to keep the company solvent. I had delivered. I had saved his legacy then, and he had repaid that loyalty by abandoning the enterprise to his arrogant daughter while he fled to Sedona. The realization that my dedication had been met with such casual betrayal did not make me sad. It made me dangerous. I knew every structural vulnerability in the company's operational architecture because I had built it. I knew where every digital file was archived, where every executive approval was logged, and where every regulatory shortcut had been taken. My offline laptop was not a tool for petty revenge. It was an instrument of accountability. As the fan of the ancient machine whirred to life, I felt a quiet sense of purpose return to my chest. The corporate theater was over, and the era of hard consequences was about to start. Over the next 72 hours, Chloe Vance's hyper-agile transformation turned Valence Dynamics into a chaotic battleground of corporate incompetence. Through my secure shadow server monitoring interface, I watched as internal panic spread across every department like wildfire. Chloe brought in 2 unvetted strategy consultants named Brad and Justin, 2 former business school classmates whose previous entrepreneurial venture was a failed venture-backed organic juice delivery startup that had gone bankrupt within 6 months. Brad and Justin roamed the executive halls, issuing arbitrary directives, scheduling mandatory 6 a.m. alignment huddles, and replacing established vendor contracts with unverified third-party software platforms. They referred to mass layoffs as necessary organizational evolution while charging the company astronomical daily consulting fees. However, Chloe's complete ignorance of administrative governance created a massive legal vulnerability. In her haste to purge senior personnel, she had completely failed to revoke my administrative access to the legacy shadow server directory, which automatically captured all high-level executive approvals and financial authorizations. As I reviewed the real-time server logs from my kitchen table, one specific transaction immediately caught my attention. Chloe had personally approved a $135,000 emergency retainer payment to an entity named Kestron Enterprises, LLC. A quick search through our historical compliance database revealed that Kestron Enterprises was a notorious offshore shell corporation, tied directly to the family trust of a primary market competitor, an entity that our legal department had explicitly blacklisted 2 years prior during a corporate espionage investigation. But an even more devastating piece of evidence was buried within the shadow server's restricted legal directory. It was a confidential settlement agreement marked under incident number 724, bearing the personal authorization signature of Chief Executive Officer Gerald Vance. The document detailed a covert $485,000 financial settlement paid out to our former Director of Regulatory Compliance, Laura Jenkins, who had abruptly resigned 8 months earlier. The settlement included a strict non-disclosure clause and a complete liability release designed to cover up severe workplace harassment allegations involving a senior executive partner. The document was dated exactly 3 days before Gerald Vance suddenly announced his unexpected wellness sabbatical in Sedona. Gerald had used company emergency contingency funds to silence a major legal scandal, disguised the transaction as a routine operational consulting expense, and then fled the corporate premises, leaving his inexperienced daughter to hold the executive reins while the evidence cooled. He had assumed the documentation was buried so deep within the encrypted legacy servers that no internal auditor would ever uncover it. But Gerald had underestimated the meticulous record-keeping of the man he had allowed his daughter to fire. Armed with this catastrophic paper trail, Patricia Albright from the Board Audit Committee initiated a formal inquiry. She dispatched an urgent confidential compliance memorandum to HR Director Janice Kohler, demanding immediate reconciliation of all fourth quarter discretionary legal disbursements and shell vendor authorizations. Janice, who had spent years covering up administrative oversights with corporate buzzwords, panicked instantly upon receiving Patricia's demand. She attempted to contact Gerald Vance on his private cellular device in Sedona, only to discover that his phone was powered off as he was supposedly engaged in off-grid meditation sessions. Left without her father's guidance, Chloe was summoned to answer preliminary questions from the board's legal counsel. Displaying her characteristic arrogance, Chloe brushed off the inquiry, declaring to corporate legal counsel that she did not concern herself with legacy operational liabilities that predated her tenure as acting chief executive officer. She failed to comprehend that by approving unauthorized retainer transfers to Kestron Enterprises, LLC, while serving as acting CEO, she had personally assumed direct fiduciary responsibility for corporate governance breaches. Later that afternoon, I arranged a private meeting with Laura Jenkins at a quiet diner located along the outskirts of the city. Laura looked weary from her past battles with the company, but her determination remained intact. I laid out the printed settlement records and shadow server audit logs across the table. When Laura reviewed the evidence, she revealed that her original non-disclosure agreement contained a specific invalidation clause. If the enterprise engaged in active regulatory fraud or failed to execute the agreed-upon compliance remediation, the confidentiality restrictions would legally void. She agreed to submit a formal sworn declaration to the board of directors, joining forces with me to expose the systemic corruption that had infected Valence Dynamics from the top down. The depth of the financial and legal irregularities uncovered in the legacy shadow server was far greater than I had initially anticipated. Beyond the $485,000 settlement to Laura Jenkins and the $135,000 retainer to Kestron Enterprises, LLC, the digital audit trails revealed a systematic pattern of executive self-dealing. Over the preceding 24 months, Gerald Vance had routinely authorized discretionary consulting payments to shell accounts controlled by personal associates, bypassing the board audit committee entirely. These payments were disguised under vague accounting categories such as strategic expansion research and brand alignment consulting. When I cross-referenced these disbursements with our internal regulatory filings, it became evident that Gerald had been draining corporate reserves to fund his private investment ventures while presenting artificially inflated profitability figures to our shareholders. Chloe's arrival had accelerated the exposure of this house of cards. In her eagerness to impress her father and demonstrate immediate cost reductions, she had unknowingly canceled the automated accounting sweeps that previously masked these irregular transactions. When Patricia Albright received my anonymous audit references, she did not simply issue a routine inquiry. She hired an independent forensic accounting firm to conduct a parallel off-site investigation. The shadow server logs provided the forensic accountants with the exact digital keys needed to decrypt 4 years of hidden executive ledgers. By the time I met Laura Jenkins at the diner, the walls were already closing in on the Vance family dynasty. Laura shared with me the immense personal toll Gerald's misconduct had taken on her career, explaining how he had leveraged his corporate authority to silence her when she first raised compliance red flags. Seeing the detailed evidence lined up in black and white gave her the strength to come forward publicly. We knew that once her sworn declaration reached the board, Gerald's carefully constructed reputation as an ethical tech leader would shatter beyond repair. 4 days ahead of his scheduled return from Sedona, Gerald Vance stormed into the corporate headquarters of Valence Dynamics like a hurricane in an expensive, tailored suit. News of the mounting audit inquiry and severe operational disruptions had finally reached him through his personal attorney, shattering his peaceful retreat. Employees reported that his shouting could be heard echoing through the executive elevator bank before he even stepped off the 14th floor. He marched past the reception desk without greeting a single staff member, his face flushed with rage and perspiration. He bypassed his daughter's daily executive mindset huddle with Brad and Justin, kicking open the double doors of the corner, suite so hard that the glass frame rattled. Gerald demanded an immediate accounting of every operational decision made during his absence. When he reviewed the revised organizational chart and realized that Chloe had terminated seasoned operational leaders, including myself, Sandeep from logistics, and Nora from procurement, he completely lost his composure. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany desk, shouting at Chloe and asking how she could possibly terminate the foundational personnel who kept the company's daily operations from collapsing. Chloe, startled and tearful, attempted to defend her actions by claiming she was merely executing his mandate to empower next-generation disruptors and eliminate legacy drag. But Gerald's fury reached a boiling point when corporate counsel handed him the audit report detailing the $135,000 authorization to Kestrin Enterprises, LLC. When Gerald realized his daughter had signed a binding contract with an entity linked to our fiercest market competitor, exposing our internal operational metrics, he looked at her with pure terror. He informed her, in front of the entire executive staff, that she had committed a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty that could subject the company to federal regulatory penalties and shareholder lawsuits. He ordered Chloe out of his office immediately, revoking her acting authority on the spot, while Brad and Justin quietly slipped out the back exit, abandoning their consulting roles the moment consequences materialized. Later that evening, an emergency executive session of the board of directors was convened at an exclusive private club downtown. Board members Patricia Albright and Granville Hughes had formally requested my presence to provide expert testimony regarding the enterprise's operational status and compliance posture. I arrived at the meeting wearing a sharp navy suit, carrying a thick red leather binder titled Chronology of Misconduct and Operational Audits. Patricia Albright called the meeting to order, introducing me to the 7 assembled board members. For the next 90 minutes, I delivered a calm, methodical, and devastating briefing. I walked the board through 14 years of operational data demonstrating how Gerald Vance had systematically mismanaged corporate reserves, engineered quiet legal cover-ups using company funds, and ultimately placed an unqualified family member in executive control to shield himself from scrutiny. I presented the verified shadow server logs detailing incident number 724, the $485,000 unauthorized harassment payout to Laura Jenkins and the illegal shell company retainer signed by Chloe Vance. Furthermore, I formally notified the board that under Title 17, Section 106 of the United States Code, I was exercising my statutory right to revoke Valence Dynamics' license to use my copyrighted operational recovery frameworks and proprietary compliance software until full administrative remediation was achieved. Without those frameworks, the company's automated logistical systems would come to a complete halt within 48 hours. Granville Hughes wiggled his pen in disbelief, while Patricia Albright noted every time-stamped record with razor-sharp precision. The evidence was absolute, unassailable, and completely ironclad. The board realized that Gerald Vance had not merely permitted administrative negligence. He had actively engineered a fraudulent corporate shield that threatened the very survival of the enterprise. The atmosphere inside the private club where the emergency board meeting took place was heavy with tension and anticipation. The 7 members of the board of directors sat around a massive oval table, surrounded by dark wood paneling and portraits of former corporate leaders. Patricia Albright sat at the head of the table, her expression stern and resolute. When I stepped into the room holding my red binder, the board members fell completely silent. They knew me. They knew I was the steady, unpretentious operational hand who had quietly kept Valence Dynamics functioning through every corporate storm. I did not open with hyperbole or emotional appeals. I opened with facts, dates, and time-stamped digital signatures. For 90 minutes, I systematically dismantled the narrative that Gerald Vance had constructed over his tenure. I demonstrated how his sudden wellness sabbatical in Sedona was not an act of executive self-care, but a calculated flight from impending regulatory scrutiny. I showed how Chloe's swift termination of key operational personnel was designed, whether she realized it or not, to eliminate the very individuals capable of recognizing the illegal shell transfers to Kestrin Enterprises, LLC. As I presented the statutory framework under Title 17, Section 106 of the United States Code, explaining that the core operational continuity software driving our logistics was my personal copyrighted intellectual property, the gravity of the situation hit the room like a physical blow. Granville Hughes leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as he reviewed the copyright registration certificates. Without my licensed architecture, Valence Dynamics could not process customer orders, track inventory, or file mandatory compliance disclosures. I informed the board that while I had dedicated 14 years to building the company, I would not allow my proprietary frameworks to be used as a shield for corporate fraud and nepotism. The board members looked at one another in grim realization. They understood that Gerald Vance had brought the enterprise to the precipice of total financial and legal ruin, and that their only path to survival was absolute transparency and swift administrative action. The final emergency assembly of the board of directors took place at 8:30 a.m. the following morning in the main corporate boardroom. Gerald Vance arrived dressed in his finest tailored navy suit, accompanied by Chloe, who wore a rose-pink blazer in a desperate attempt to project professional legitimacy. Neither of them realized that the board had already reviewed my red binder during the previous evening's executive session. When they took their seats at the end of the long glass conference table, the atmosphere in the room was as cold and silent as a tomb. Patricia Albright opened the proceedings without engaging in any pleasantries. She projected the shadow server audit logs and financial transfer records directly onto the large wall displays, highlighting the specific line items representing the $485,000 covert settlement and the unauthorized shell payment to Kestrin Enterprises, LLC. Gerald attempted to interject, offering a practiced defense about internal risk management and discretionary executive authority. But Patricia cut him off immediately, stating that discretionary authority did not extend to concealing regulatory liabilities. misallocating corporate funds, or violating federal disclosure standards under Section 806 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Granville Hughes then took the floor, presenting the sworn legal declaration submitted by Laura Jenkins, which corroborated every detail of the regulatory cover-up. Chloe suddenly panicked, shouting that the entire proceeding was as a coordinated witch hunt orchestrated by bitter former employees who were jealous of her modernizing vision. Gerald turned to his daughter and sternly ordered her to remain silent, but the damage was already done. Patricia Albright called for an immediate vote of confidence regarding executive management. The board voted unanimously to place both Gerald Vance and Chloe Vance on immediate, indefinite administrative leave, stripping them of all corporate authority and revoking their access to company facilities. External forensic auditors and federal compliance investigators were brought in before noon to secure all physical and digital records. Escorted by private security personnel, Gerald and Chloe were forced to gather their personal belongings and leave the premises through the rear service exit to avoid news cameras. At 6:15 a.m. on Monday morning, an official enterprise-wide notification was broadcast across all internal communication channels. The announcement declared that effective immediately, Nathan Miller had been appointed Interim Chief Operating Officer of Valence Dynamics, Inc., reporting directly to the Board of Directors. My first executive action upon assuming the role was to reinstate Nora, Jason, and Brian with full back pay and formal corporate commendations. I also initiated a complete overhaul of our compliance governance, ensuring that every operational process adhered strictly to federal regulations and ethical standards. As I walked down the executive corridor toward the Chief Operating Officer's suite, I paused outside the frosted glass door that had once bore Gerald Vance's name. The old nameplate had been removed, replaced by a sleek brushed steel plaque that read simply Office of the Chief Operating Officer. I looked back at the long journey that had brought me to this moment. 14 years of quiet dedication, the humiliation of an arbitrary firing, and the decisive victory of truth over arrogant nepotism. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped inside to rebuild the enterprise on a foundation of unyielding integrity. The fallout from the board's decisive action sent shockwaves through the entire industry. Within hours of Gerald Vance and Chloe Vance being escorted from the premises, federal regulatory authorities issued formal subpoenas for Valence Dynamics' financial ledgers and executive communications. The news of the executive purge broke across major business news outlets, with headlines highlighting the dramatic downfall of a tech CEO who had attempted to pass control of a publicly traded enterprise to his unqualified daughter. But inside the headquarters of Valence Dynamics, the mood was one of immense relief and quiet celebration. When I walked through the main doors on Monday morning, as Interim Chief Operating Officer, the very employees who had watched in horror as I was escorted out 4 days prior stood up from their desks and applauded. I gathered the entire staff in the main atrium for an unannounced assembly. I did not speak in empty buzzwords or deliver rehearsed corporate platitudes. I spoke with honesty, humility, and absolute clarity. I told them that the era of arbitrary management, nepotism, and compliance shortcuts was officially over. I announced the immediate reinstatement of Nora, Jason, and Brian, restoring their full benefits and senior standing. I assured the team that operational stability, ethical compliance, and mutual respect would be the sole guiding principles of our enterprise moving forward. Over the following weeks, we worked tirelessly to audit every department, repair damaged vendor relationships, and cooperate fully with federal investigators. Under my leadership, Valence Dynamics experienced a remarkable turnaround. Our operational efficiency reached historic highs, not through ruthless cost-cutting or buzzword-heavy initiatives, but through empowering experienced professionals and respecting statutory governance. The potted succulent that had sat on my desk for 7 years was returned to its rightful place on the windowsill of the Chief Operating Officer's suite, a quiet, enduring symbol that true competence, integrity, and perseverance will always triumph over arrogant entitlement.